Yes, so I'm Professor of Social Policy at the University of Ulster. I'm retired full-time, but I'm continuing on a part-time contract, mainly to do research and writing. I'm now based in Coleraine, but until a couple of years ago I was based at Magee campus. And most of the work I've done relates to social policy and devolution. So it's from that background, originally from a philosophical background, which of course is where I first came across the concept of human rights. And I've been recently published a number of books, some by myself, some with colleagues. One on adult social care with Anne-Marie Gray, one on social work in Northern Ireland with Deirdre Heenan, but two that I did myself on the impact of devolution on social policy and comparing devolved governments, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So that's the background.
Okay.
So that was 5 minutes.
So your time starts now, as they say in all the quiz shows.
It's just really 4 points maybe from the submission. I mean, there's a large number of points in the submission, but I'll just mention 4. One was looking closely at the NHS constitution in England, which is really a statement of health rights. And it is interesting because in that document and the related handbook, it does trace a large number of rights in health back to either human rights documents or health legislation or other government statements. So it gives the kind of background. And it goes through a number of key rights about rights to dignity and care, safe environment, treated with respect, confidentiality, and so on. And then a large number of pledges. The difference is that the pledges cannot be legally enforced, whereas the health rights can be. And that applies to England. There is a version in Scotland. In fact, Scotland passed a Patient Rights Act a couple of years ago, and it has a similar charter. Wales is a slightly different sort of document. Northern Ireland really doesn't have any such document. Now, it's possible then to trace that to what is relevant to accident and emergency provision, obviously dignity, safety, right to privacy and so on. That has been done. So the second point is that, of course, accident and emergency care takes place within a wider health provision, and lots of developments in healthcare do impact upon accident and emergency. There's a kind of list of these, but obviously one that is much in the news is transforming your care, where the idea of shifting more emphasis onto community health and community social care should relieve pressure on acute care, including accident and emergency provision. So that was the second point, and of course you can associate that with problems in health cut and the configuration of hospitals and similar issues like that, and ideas about dividing up emergency provision. The third point is about governance in Northern Ireland, the system of governance. And that, of course, unlike Britain, we don't have NHS hospital trusts. Hospitals are part of much larger trusts. In fact, our trusts are among the largest in the United Kingdom. The health trusts are very large bodies indeed. And they are provider bodies. They're not commissioning bodies. So we operate with this commissioning provider system, which was meant originally to drive up efficiency and productivity through competition for who would actually provide the services. But it hasn't really worked like that. And it's somewhat difficult to work out who is actually in charge of, say, something like accident and emergency, where control of it actually rests, and this division between provider, commissioner. And the last point, fourth point, is I did provide some detailed comments about participation, public participation. That's one of the things the Commission is looking at. And Northern Ireland actually doesn't do very well in terms of public and user participation, which has really become a massive issue in England, Scotland, Wales. There's all sorts of schemes that have been introduced to promote user participation. Foundation Health Trusts, which is the model for acute hospitals dealing with emergency care in Britain, has quite an evolved system whereby the executive board is partly appointed by and accountable to a board of governors who come from the users and residents of the local area. It's built in like that, and there's all sorts of devices like public partnership forums and clinical references groups, which are used in a more consultative way. But there is actually an attempt in Scotland, they call it co-production, to actually say that services should be run both by the professionals but also by users or users by experience. So there's quite a large area there, and you can look at its relevance for accident and emergency.
Okay.
Run my time.
No, you're great on time. I'm going to ask Paul to open the session with some questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Derek. I really appreciated reading your submission, and thanks for making the time to write it and for joining us this afternoon. First, it's actually I was struck by one. Your submission is very rich, but I was struck by one omission. And the omission I found very sort of instructive, actually, and very revealing. And I just wanted to mention it and see if you'd got any comment on it. And I was struck by the fact that, unless I missed it, which is possible, you don't deal with any of the relevant international human rights standards. And I have to say that in the course of the inquiry, I'm finding it interesting because the international human rights standards are pretty low down anybody's agenda. So I was struck by the fact that you talk about, you write in your submission about Human Rights Act and various pledges and so forth and so on, but not international human rights. And just a related point, at the end, you helpfully talk about a role for a rights agenda in emergency treatment. And I would just observe that one means of scrutiny, albeit a very, very weak form of scrutiny, is in the United Nations. And just a few months ago, actually, the UK government submitted a report to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and that'll be considered by the committee probably next year, October next year. Maybe it might slip over into the following year. So there's a little accountability mechanism for this sort of stuff at the UN level. But anyhow, I wondered if you had any brief comment about the absence of the international rights.
Yes, not a lot really. It was probably deliberate, reading either the background paper or that York paper that I read from University of York. They did go into some detail on international conventions and so on, but I thought I would just focus on the UK dimension, which you could argue is more directly relevant to Northern Ireland, and of course that's where it tends to be on comparing devolution that I've done some work, and I'm not. I get a bit concerned about trying to adopt, European models to Northern Ireland. I'm a bit of toing and froing at the moment about public sector reform. And some civil servants suggesting that we'll look at Denmark and Norway and dear knows where, and rather ignoring, say, Scotland and Wales, which is rather more relevant.
Okay, thank you. One of the points in your submission, and it was one of your 4 points that you made just now, I think it's terribly important, where you write, there is a difficulty in considering emergency treatment in isolation from related and broader policy issues. Absolutely right. And we're sort of have a constant tension. On the one hand, personally speaking, I like the specificity of emergency treatment, looking at emergency care, because then you can drill down and get into specifics. But then you have to place that in this wider context. And I keep being brought back to issues of health governance, which is really what your paper is about, health governance and participation. So I really appreciated your paper. And then in your paper, again, you alluded to it. You emphasised that there's the commissioner-provider divide has been operating for health services in Northern Ireland with the 5 boards. They're the provider bodies commissioned to deliver services. And then, as you just observed 5 minutes ago, the aim of this system was through competition to drive productivity, efficiency, and improvement. Could you briefly help me a bit, educate me about the competition? The competition was meant to come where?
Between the trusts. This was the not my idea.
It's not your idea.
This was the
conception.
first Appleby review.
Yes, the Appleby review. So this was competition between trusts.
Yes, it's taken from the English model at the time, that the trusts would actually compete with each other for services from the commissioning body. Now, you couldn't do it really the whole country. It would be difficult, but in theory it would mean that the Western Trust could actually make a bid to provide part, maybe, of emergency provision from people who live in the northern area, and their bid would undercut and be better standard and so on.
Right.
And I mean, that's the way the commissioner-provider division should work. Now, it may work in a small number of cases, but it's rather difficult to see it working in a small country like Northern Ireland. You know, it's kind of sort of worked in England, and to some extent they've gone back to that in England with the new clinical commissioning groups. Obviously, it's not really maybe so suitable for emergency care if you're looking at, you know, travel distance of 1 hour or something. Obviously, that would interfere with the idea that we take the cheapest bid, as it were.
And you point out that this hasn't really functioned as intended, and it's become really a system for the, quote, allocation of monies on a geographical basis.
Yes, but I mean, I certainly have seen criticisms that the clinical commissioning groups really carry out a rubber stamp function. Basically, the plan comes to them from the Health and Social Care Trust, and the group who are the clinical commissioning group really just rubber stamp it, so they're not even saying what are the particular needs in that area, right, and so on. So it's basically moved a kind of allocation process, and you can look at the documentation. I mean, this is the northern one, the local one, and you'll see that it doesn't really do any major calculation of what is a real need for a service in this particular area. You know.
And the group you just referred to, that's what in the framework document they call local commissioning groups. Yes, that's what you're referring to. Well, that was going to be one of my questions, because I am struck by the role that they're meant to play in this document, the framework document. But in discussions with people and listening to people, they haven't really featured.
No.
So
they don't have independent status. They don't have any. They are set up in legislation, but they're not independent of the Health and Social Care Trust, as Marion would know. So they're actually subcommittees of the Health and Social Care Trust. So it's easy for them to take a centralised approach.
So who are they? The LCGs. You know, they should be identifying local priorities and taking into account the views of patients, clients, carers, wider communities, service providers.
They're local health professionals who are appointed. They have some local councillors. I think there's 4 local councillors on each group, and there's 1 or 2 sort of community social representatives. And so it's what I call the follow the Quango model.
Yes.
The follow the Quango, they're appointed board. But to what extent they have full-time staff actually calculating and assessing needs and planning meeting needs, as the way the clinical commissioning groups in England have started to work, I think you'd probably have to carry out research or something on it.
But in the framework document, it does say these LCGs should be identifying local priorities, taking into account the views of patients, clients, carers, wider communities, and service providers. I mean, in your judgment, is that happening?
I don't think so. No doubt. in some groups, patient-client council and so on, may make representations and
Right.
forward material to them. I think the Northern Ireland BMA
Right.
did produce a paper saying why they weren't working, saying they weren't working from their perspective.
Right. And I think if I caught it correctly, you said they're sort of rubber stamping what comes down from the board. Not the. Do you mean the commissioning board or the?
Yes,
the
the commissioning board. Yes, the
Right.
commissioning board.
Okay, thank you very much for this. And again, in your paper, you pick up something that I've been wrestling with. It's the appointment of these non-executive directors.
Yes.
So, see, one thing that I've been struggling with is the degree to which there is sort of proper public participation in the health system, including in EDs. And when I've talked about it with people, they've said, oh, well, we've got the non-executive directors. But the impression I'm getting is, and it might be wrong, so please, if you think it's wrong, please say. But the impression I'm getting is that those non-executive directors, I think there are 6 on each board, that they provide an important service as sort of professionals. It's a sort of professional service. So I'm not knocking it, it's important. But they don't seem to construct their role as sort of reaching out to the community and getting views of the community and bringing them back. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's a good way of describing it. I mean, they provide expertise from management background or whatever, but they don't see themselves as representing the public and as far as I can see, apart from the chairperson, they don't really appear in public or make public statements or attend many sessions or communicate, or they're probably largely inaccessible to the public. They probably weren't meant to be, but so they fit the role you've just described,
which is worthy and important.
Yeah.
But so I was wondering, and I don't know if you care to respond to it off the cuff, is that presently there are 6 non-executive directors. I wondered whether 3 should remain with their present function and role, but 3 could be, in terms of reference, actually required to sort of outreach to communities, to try and engage with communities, both to take decisions down to the communities, that might be quite uncomfortable, but also to bring views back.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Oh yes, I would support that. I mean, the danger with the Quango model is that the person, when appointed, just acts as a member of the board and don't see themselves as representing any other views. And it's just been repeated, that model, with the integrated care partnerships which they've set up, where one person may represent the voluntary sector, but they come from a specific voluntary group, and it's not spelt out that they have any other role. But so it would be an idea. I mean, Scotland, Wales, England, if you look at, they have experimented, of course, with the membership. Scotland actually has piloted directly elected health boards. It didn't go very well, the pilot, but they have recently piloted that. And the Scottish health boards, I think, have wide representation. Well, they're not very large, but they have representation from the local councils and from trade unions, I think, and so on. So they've got a wider representation.
But if one went down that road of 6 executive directors, 3 with their present function, as it were, then 3 who are mandated to try and reach out to communities, how would they do that? I mean, how would they go and engage with communities? I mean, how would they do it?
What happened, or the evidence from Britain, examples from Britain, are that it would be like sort of public participation partnerships. NHS England has just started with clinical reference groups, which include users and patients and so on. So the schemes like that. Now, I think in order for that to work, you need quite a buoyant structure of user organisations. You need to promote user organisations. That could be a role for the Patient-Client Council. I mean, there's not very many user organisations in Northern Ireland. And of course, one of the problems is that you can lead to that becoming professionalised. In England, you've really got kind of professional user representatives, because they can't be paid in some of these roles, and so there's a slight danger there.
But I'm interested you mentioned the PCC, because in this idea that I'm just exploring, I don't know where the PCC would fit in that. So if you had 3 non-executive directors whose job it is to sort of outreach to communities, in a way that's what PCC should be doing, right?
Yes, it could be.
So I don't know how that would fit with the role of the PCC. Do you see my quandary? On the one hand, the idea of 3 executive directors outreach to the communities, but on the other hand, we've already got the PCC, the statutory body. So how would those two fit together?
PPC could be more a promotional role. Now, I think, there's so much experimentation with public participation, you lose track of all the schemes. But I think in Scotland they do have a promotional body as well as lots of schemes for getting people onto boards and trusts and so on. So there might still be a role for an overall promotional body. I mean, it's quite a large task to promote user organisations if you're starting from scratch.
So maybe...
the one area that you do get it a bit more in Northern Ireland is in mental health user organisations. That's about the only area where it's developed really a bit in Northern Ireland.
So perhaps the 3 non-executive directors with this responsibility that I've just signalled, perhaps they then turn to the PCC to help them do the community engagement. Perhaps because these 3 individuals, 3 on each trust, they wouldn't know. They might not know how to do it themselves. They might have their own little community group, but their job would not be to represent one community group. It would be to try and represent, as it were.
Except you also might want to look at the English model of the NHS Foundation Trusts and the Board of Governors model, which is more radical. Well, in theory it's more radical. We'd have to look how it works in practice. But in a sense, the governing board of the trust is basically anyone who is a user or lives in the area who can be bothered to join up and participate.
Well, one last question. Thank you for being so patient, colleagues, and thank you, Derek, for your help. One last question I've got is about the PPI, roles in personal and public involvement, and then I was interested to learn that there's a PPI forum, which was news to me, I have to say. Do you know anything about the PPI forum?
Not a lot.
It's chaired by the PHA and involves representatives from all HSC organisations. It's been established for the purpose of promoting personal and public involvement.
No, I can't say very much about it. I mean, each trust has to have a PPI plan, and there would be some schemes launched onto that, mainly in the area of consultation, focus groups, and so on, that kind of area. But just what the role of that forum is, I'm not so sure.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Marion.
Hi, Derek.
Hi, Marion.
Hi. I have only one question. In terms of, you mentioned transforming your care and shifting the emphasis from hospital care to social care. Have you had any thoughts in terms of the financial front-loading of the system to allow that to happen, that would ensure that patients didn't suffer during that transition period? Yeah,
well, that's a good issue to highlight, because the Transforming Your Care document or strategy that developed envisaged only something like a 2% transfer, which would be barely keeping up with inflation, to move 2% from acute care to community health and social care, plus some transitional costs, which may be well being spent at the moment. So I think to really make a difference, leading to less demand and less need for acute care, you would need much more support for the community health and social care approach, both in various ways. I mean, it's maybe not all finance. It could include legislation. I mean, Northern Ireland doesn't have any legislation to promote integration. England, Scotland, Wales all have very recently passed legislation. Mm-hmm. You'd probably need more support for carers to make it work. There would be financial front-loading there, more support for carers, because again, Northern Ireland's lagging behind a bit, the new provisions in England. And probably and it again would demand some expenditure. You need to develop the social care workforce. You would really have to develop the social care workforce in ways, again, which is happening in Britain, things like social care apprenticeships and direct payments officers and so on. There's a whole workforce that almost doesn't exist in Northern Ireland. And it's quite a big area. Sorry, just for 1 second. That Wales, they have indicated that promoting community health and social care is the fourth largest area for job creation in Wales, fourth largest area, after like IT and tourism and financial services. In Northern Ireland, it's never mentioned as a major, and of course it involves the private and voluntary sector, not just or mainly those, not just statutory sector. So yes, that would certainly require some further injection of funds to actually move the pressure away from acute care.
And has any research been done either on the quantum or the period of time that you would need that?
No, I haven't seen any other than the original Transforming Your Care documents.
Thank you. Thanks.
Derek, I have two questions. One is just to pick up what you'd said in your opening remarks about the NHS Constitution. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about either whether it's the English, the Welsh, or the Scottish model, and there are clearly variants. Your view about the value of having some variation that was for Northern Ireland, and what do you think it would bring in added value in terms of having a kind of equivalent of an NHS constitution for the services that are delivered here?
Yeah. I mean, it's maybe two values. One is the kind of legal one, which I maybe can't say so much about, that the rights are the rights themselves, as opposed to the pledges, are really legal rights, and in a sense the NHS Constitution puts them together, sets them out very clearly, so that it can be used both by providers and users. So in a sense they should be adopted to that. Now I think the evidence is there hasn't really been any big growth in litigation, as you might call it, because of the NHS Constitution. So whether it legally empowers people is not so clear, but it is a kind of commitment of policy stance, and where the government stands, where all staff employed in the NHS should stand. And if you look at the NHS England first annual report, NHS England's new body, part of the big restructuring, which really runs the NHS in England, their first report, it gives, I mean, I was wondering about this myself, whether, it's something people keep in the drawer, they don't carry the handbook around in their pocket, or patients don't. But if you read the report, it gives a very high profile to the NHS Constitution. It says this is one of our main benchmarks to see how we are performing. So that sort of cheered me up a bit, or thought it was justified putting this forward. The one in Scotland is, I think it's emerged as the Charter of Patients' Rights and Responsibilities. In fact, I have it here. And the name might be somewhat off-putting. I don't know if you'd be terribly excited about the Charter of Patients' Rights and Responsibilities, but it is fairly similar. It's copied, but not quite as well done as the NHS Constitution. Wales has their own slightly different version, which is Standards in Wales, this document. And it's interesting that the second standard is about human rights, actually the second standard. But I don't think the Welsh one is really any legal basis. The Scottish one, because it's based on the Patients' Rights Scotland Bill Act, it's Patients' Rights Scotland Act, is of course perhaps more legally enforceable than the English one, the NHS Constitution. So, sorry, to answer your question, I mean, it is worth saying that it would be of some value in Northern Ireland. And I mean, in a sense, it's policy copying. It's not something outrageous. It's what happens in the rest of the UK to some sense. And the English one certainly does make references to things that are very close to accident and emergency. There's a lot about dignity and respect and privacy and confidentiality and prompt treatment and access and so on. The Scottish one I find slightly vaguer, but the English one would be highly relevant for accident and emergency. And you know, the question might be more, why does Northern Ireland not have it? Now, whether it's the whole thing or whether you might want to have a specific one for accident and emergency. The Scottish one actually publishes 6 different subversions for 6 different areas. So there's one like for acute care. They have part of it, the way it's drafted and published. Maybe one for mental health, one for acute care, and so on. So, I mean, because I'm not a detailed expert in accident and emergency, my inclination would be to look at a wider one.
Final question for me, and it leads on from this. One of the issues that we've explored with in the evidence hearings to date has been the idea of a human rights framework for accident and emergency. And the process has been very interesting in as much as the starting point of the discussion is often that, well, that's not something that's embedded in what we do. And then when you tease that out a bit and you talk about participation and involvement, right to respect, dignity, privacy, accountability and feedback mechanisms, etc. What tends to happen then is an interchange which suggests, well, actually, those things underpin what we do implicitly, but they're not explicitly set out as in a human rights framework within trusts or boards or other healthcare bodies. So I wondered whether you have a view on whether you think the idea of a human rights framework, going beyond just a kind of constitution or a kind of general statement, is something that would be of value, and if so, again, what it might bring to the table, and whether you have any sense of, in your work in England, Scotland, Wales, or if you've done anything in the Republic, of examples of that elsewhere where there has been a kind of human rights framework brought to the table.
Well, I suppose going back to the previous answer a little bit, that to some extent the NHS constitution is based on a kind of human rights framework, and therefore we have to kind of monitor whether the main achievement or objective is somehow to promote litigation even, or give people legal rights, or whether it's to put it more in a rights framework that people will be conscious of, or the staff and so on will be.
I suppose what I'm thinking of is how you might embed policy and practice within a human rights framework. So going beyond what I'll call a very high-level framework that sets the, quite important, it seems to me, that sets the framework and the parameters, to the notion that you then move to, I think one of the people who gave evidence to us at a senior level in trust said a good a good healthcare worker is a good human rights worker. It's how you get down to that level of both for staff in terms of delivering services, but and the services that go to patients, but also then the notion that perhaps patients, in terms of what's expected of them and how they treat staff, is also a kind of an issue of everybody within the health service, whether you provide the service or you're the recipient, has kind of rights, and you should acknowledge that. So I wonder if you have any sense of any examples where you've gone beyond the kind of high level framework and parameters down to the kind of idea of trying to embed it into practice.
Yeah. It's I'm not so aware of material now embedding it in practice. Certainly in Scotland and Wales you would tend to have more reference maybe to issues of equity and equality and health inequalities and social justice, if you read the kind of narratives that they give to justify the approach. They mention rights as well, but not particularly focus on rights. The NHS constitution, it is somewhat more interesting because especially the handbook, which does trace everything back to a legal document, and of course quite a number of them are human rights acts. So it makes a direct link to the human rights acts for things like respect, dignity, even things like prolonging life or giving priority to prolonging life, or priority to palliative cases and so on. But some of it just traces back to health legislation, but it is, the health formulation then is as an entitlement or a right, is a slightly different issue there. But so it does source it back, right to dignity, right to confidentiality, privacy and treatment. And then the other side is, of course, pointing out what interferes with that right. So it would be waiting hours on a trolley, I assume, or what might be constituted abuse. And of course, in England, you see, this is why it's maybe become an issue again in England because of the Francis report, that all staff and all trusts of all kinds are expected to be very aware of the rights or dignity aspects. So you might want to measure, the practice, trace it back to the rights, and then point out what interferes with that, what shouldn't be done, kind of thing. Maybe. But I'm not sure of any. There could be. I haven't come across any research really looking at that to date.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to ask?
No, thank you very much.
Is there anything you want to say kind of finally, Derek, before we wrap up this session?
No, I mean, I started off, a bit sceptical about rights, like the first comment I make on health, rights and health, because I come more from the philosophical background. If you discuss rights, you always end up in a conflict of rights and so on. How do you solve those? But having read through a lot of the material and gone back to some of the material I'd read earlier because of my work, like co-production in Scotland and so on, you could see how rights kept coming in. It wasn't something strange. It was actually to some extent there already, but needed teasing out. And if you could show it to all staff that in doing certain things they were actually following a rights agenda rather than just some kind of charter, it might actually be a benefit.
Actually, if I
you may,
if I may, Derek, excuse me. I think you weren't here, but in a previous session this afternoon, it was observed by a clinician that he suggested that some 12, 13, 14 years ago, there was more investment in the health system in England than there was proportionately in Northern Ireland. And his argument was that having had that greater investment in England, then these targets were introduced, which he had a big problem with. He didn't like them at all. But these targets were introduced, and then he sort of said, well, what do you expect? We didn't reach the targets because more investment, pro rata investment, had gone into England than in Northern Ireland. And I was very interested in that argument. I have to say I hadn't heard that argument before, because I had the idea that actually per capita there's greater investment in health in Northern Ireland than per capita in England. But his point was making a slightly different one. He was saying that historically, some 15, 14 years ago, there was this different investment in health system. And I hope I'm sufficiently clear. If you understand what I mean, I just wondered if you had any reflection on that. Does that, maybe you don't know, or does that, in your work on devolution, I just wondered whether you'd come across any writing which argued that there was more investment in the health system in England some 14 years ago than in Northern Ireland 14 years ago.
It doesn't seem likely in terms of actual expenditure per capita, which is the one you mentioned. I expect 14 years ago, which was during Derek Birrell, it would have been higher in Northern Ireland, health expenditure. I don't think I've ever seen it lower, because it's determined then as well by the Barnett formula. No, sorry, health wasn't determined by the Barnett formula, but what Northern got overall was determined by the Barnett formula. Now, it would have been possible that after that more was spent in England on health than Northern Ireland, but my recollection of the figures is that would not have been the case. Expenditure would always have been higher in Northern Ireland. It's just possible the Derek Birrell health minister in 1 or 2 years managed to reverse that expenditure, but it may, the view of the person, it may be reflecting more perhaps capital expenditure.
I think the evidence that was being given this afternoon was kind of, I think you used the term infrastructure, was that before introducing the targets, the 4 and the 12-hour target, they put a lot of investment into England, and he was talking about kind of so that you could have a lot of other kind of care elsewhere, so that everything didn't all end up in the emergency department, and that whatever that initiative was, it didn't happen in Northern Ireland. So we didn't get the same investment in the infrastructure around emergency department, but got the targets, and England got the investment and the targets, and therefore not surprising that we had performed badly. I think that was, so I think he was talking not so much in the global spend on health, but in the kind of infrastructure that eases the pressures on A&E. I think, is that fair? I think that's what the point that was being made.
It's not quite as far back as that. Around about 2000, there were a number of reports published in Northern Ireland about future of hospitals, and from recollection they tended to be suggesting even at that stage Northern Ireland had an excess of acute provision, but so I'm not, I can't really, it's hard to know.
Thank you very much.
Derek, an offer which I can make to you, which we've made to everybody that's given evidence, which is that if there's any additional material that you would like to supply us with, or that you think would be very useful background reading, we would find that very welcome. I suspect Roshi might blanch at the idea of getting several more documents to read, but it would be very useful. And if you have any further observations, and your written evidence as well as your evidence today has been really helpful to us. So thank you for coming in today. It's been really useful.